So thank you for rejoining me on this Christadelphian video talk on the strength of the evidence for a young Earth. And we're now going to look at some of the many evidences for a recent creation. As we saw in the first part, Genesis indicates that God made the heavens and the earth at this time of in the beginning, which was at the time when Adam and Eve were created. We saw from the, as we finished that genealogy, that was about 6,000 years ago. So what are the evidences? Well, the very fact that there's no simple life has been found is an incredible evidence that evolution can't be true. Now, if there's a little star by it, it's something we're going to look at in more detail in a moment. So we'll come back to this one. Human population. The population of the Earth today, we can show mathematically, fits in with the concept that after the time of the flood, Noah and his 3 children emerged from the flood, and those children, those 3 families, the whole Earth was repopulated, and genetics actually takes us back to 3 people, 3 different genetic links, which is evidence there. But the way, the time periods of reproduction, we have a population which fits in with life on the Earth from the time of the flood, about 3,600 years ago. Whereas evolution says, no. Man goes back much further. It goes back 200,000 years. Well, 200,000 years, we should have a population far exceeding anything we see today. The human population of today does fit the biblical record. We also know, and this is a more recent understanding of genetics, that every time a human being is conceived, the genetic information from mother and father are amalgamated, but there are always a few, because there are so many genetic markers, as we understand today, that there are always a few mistakes. Doesn't normally matter. The body has a wonderful way of making sure those aren't harmful. Sometimes they are, but in the main, they're not harmful. But what is interesting, we now can study what the number of mistakes we would expect every generation. And when we look back at the oldest human bones, DNA that we can access, and see the number of changes, again, it fits in with, from the time of the flood to today, of being the right number of generations. Whereas again, if we take evolutionary ideas of 200,000 years, then there should be far more mistakes compared with the oldest material that we can find. So these are just little indications to point us, well, yes, the Bible timetable does make sense. The moon receding, again, we'll look at that in more detail. Coastal erosion. Our coasts are being eroded, and on average, it's about 0.5 meter to 2 meters is lost every year. Well, if we took 1/10 of that figure and said, well, let's say 50 centimeters, 2 inches lost every year, if the Earth was 4.6 billion years, it was a time before there were oceans, but they thought, evolutionary ideas, well, there were oceans 3 billion years ago. Then the erosion, 3 billion years at 50 millimeters a year, is an immense distance. It's 150,000 kilometers. That's nearly 4 times the circumference of the Earth. So theoretically, there shouldn't be any standing land. It should all have been eroded away. And we know that's not the case. And very similar to that, the rivers take sediment down and deposit it into the oceans. And it's estimated about 25 billion tons of material is constantly being washed into the oceans. And yet, where is the evidence of that? Over 6,000 years, that doesn't amount to an awful lot. Fits in with the kind of sedimentation we've gotten, especially as we have to reset the clock at the time of the flood, so 3,500 years ago. That fits what we see. It doesn't fit the evolutionary timescale of 3 billion years of sediment being washed into the oceans. There should be far more material in the estuaries and out into the oceans if the Earth was that old. Carbon-14 levels. Carbon-14 is rather unstable. It has a half-life of roughly 6,000 years. And it's what's used, and we'll look at this in more detail in the third part. It's used to date once living material. It exists in the atmosphere, and it's constantly being lost by plants taking in carbon dioxide, and with it the carbon-14, and that gets taken into the trees and the plants, and then we as animals live on that plant material and take it into ourselves. Now, Libby, who discovered that you could use carbon-14 as a dating process, he estimated that after about 30,000 years, there should be a balance. Nitrogen-14 is changed into carbon-14 by cosmic radiation. We'll look at that in a moment. And he estimated, yes, it's after about 30,000 years it will be in balance. And because he believed in evolution, well, much longer time period had existed. So that was no problem. More recently, they've begun to look at the balance. Is it being equally made as it is being lost? Is it in balance? And the answer is no. There is an imbalance, pointing to the fact the Earth is much younger than 30,000 years. So there's just another little piece that tells us that there's something wrong with the dating processes. If we think of the salt levels in the sea, about 450 million tons of sodium is dumped into the sea from land every year. Why aren't the oceans like the Dead Sea, absolutely salty, if that had been going on for millions of years? If it's only been going on for 6,000 years, then yes, that makes sense. It's got a bit more salty than it was originally, but with a short time period, that's no major problem. It points to a young Earth. Fresh dinosaur bones and blood, again, very fascinating. We'll look at that in more detail. Rapid strata formation. We know how the rocks of the Earth are formed of strata, and we're told that this takes millions of years for just a small section of strata to be laid down. Yet we know from Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980, so only 40 years ago, that just in a short period of time, a matter of days, many feet, many meters of strata were laid down, looking perfectly normal and natural. And we know they're all laid down in just 3 days. So that indicates to us that we don't need thousands of years for a few millimeters of sediment to be built up. In fact, there's an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph last year talking about the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. It's thought now that was formed in days rather than thousands of years. Many evidences that it doesn't need long time periods to lay down rock strata. And we don't see fossils being formed today. Animals die, they get eaten and bones scavenged and that. And yet there are millions of fossils formed. And many of those fossils haven't changed at all. Now, allegedly they're millions of years old, and yet haven't changed at all. So that's an interesting concept, isn't it? And the other fascinating thing is that things like shellfish, when they die, they open up. Now, all the fossils of shellfish and similar things that change when they die have all been found in the closed position. In other words, the fossils were of living creatures suddenly overwhelmed and rapidly buried and subject to heat, which caused them to turn into fossils, which exactly matches what the picture the Bible gives us of the flood and the devastation of the flood. Whereas it doesn't make sense, because when an animal dies, it gets scavenged. It doesn't get turned into a fossil, which needs to be rapidly buried. So you've got to have rapid stratas formed. And we find all the fossils are in the sedimentary, the waterborne layers. And so again, it points to the flood as being the answer to the fossils, and the fact that we have fossils today which exactly match fossils that were buried, we believe, in the time of the flood. Makes sense. But to believe that evolution stood still for millions of years doesn't make sense. When we date oil and coal, we don't find old ages, we find young ages. Don't normally bother to date them because they're known because of evolutionary ideas. And this is where evolutionary thinking influences so much, that they must be very old because they belong to a time period way, way back in way distant past. But actually, when you do carbon-14 dating on oil and coal, you get a date which is very compatible to the 3,500 years back to the time of the flood. Carbon-14 in buried diamonds, we'll look at that in a moment. And the very fact that 70% of the Earth's crust is covered in sedimentary rocks, and the other 30% is where the volcanoes are pushed up through the sedimentary rocks and cover them over. But it shows at one time the whole Earth was covered with water, and within that water are the fossils. So there was a time period when the Earth was overwhelmed with a dramatic flood, which caused this rapid burial of the fossils. And when we look in our third part at dating methods, they're fatally flawed because of the assumptions which are made, and because nobody can reproduce creation and ancient times. There's no method of showing that the evolutionary ideas aren't incorrect. Human links still missing. Darwin thought that because he couldn't find a very good succession from apes to man, it was because, well, they've remained to be discovered. Well, 150 years more gone on since the time of Darwin, and the opacity of the skeletons that have been found to show this alleged linkage. There are very few fossils, and evolutionists, those who are experts in that field, admit that there isn't really any evidence for the evolution from an ape to a man. It's just a nice idea, but it is an illusion. So let's look in a bit more detail at some of these things. No simple life has been found. The oldest bacteria that is known to man is claimed to be 3 billion years old. First life allegedly 3.5 billion years ago. So this is very old life. So it should be very, very primitive. Life was only just beginning to evolve, according to evolutionists. Yet when they came to study it, it was found to have flagella. Now, the bottom picture shows a bacteria with a single tail. This oldest bacteria didn't have one tail, it had 7 tails. And it had an immensely complex system of gearing, which ensured that all those tails rotated at the same speed and in sync one with another. Were driven by these molecular motors. And, you know, it is so incredible, this mechanism. It had these gears that cause these 7 flagella to rotate, and using something which we use today in modern helicopters and that, but this is supposed to be simple life. And the researchers that did this said that apart from there being no metal and wires and that, what we have here, these little motors that cause it to rotate, are just like a modern AC brushless motor, except it's 1/200,000th smaller than man's best device. So how can that evolve? Just a brief period of time. As I say, there's no such thing as simple life. Everything is very complex. And so what we see, the more we look back and see the complexity, and as I say, the James Webb telescope is reinforcing this. Everything was complex, however far back we go. And that tells us, well, there must be a designer, a mind, that can bring about this. There's no way this could evolve. You can't evolve a mechanism to cause 7 tails to all rotate in sync. There's not the ability in DNA. You need information. You need the genetic information. That can't evolve. Information doesn't evolve. It has to be there in the beginning. You can lose information. You can't gain information. The receding moon, simple thing, but if the present is the key to the past, well, we observe that the moon is moving away from the Earth at a very small rate, about 3.8 centimetres a year, so 1.5 inches a year. But it is just moving fractionally further and further away from the Earth. Now, in 6,000 years, because the moon and the Earth were created about the same time, existed at the same time. So if the present is the key to the past, then it's been moving away ever since for 6,000 years, we would say, from the Bible. Well, it means it's only moved 228 meters, which in the sum total of 384,000 kilometers is nothing. But if that had been going on for 4.6 billion years, then that's 174,000 kilometers. So instead of being 384,000 kilometers, it would only been 210,000 kilometers. Now we know what the effect of the moon is upon the Earth, the tides. It said if the moon were only 10% closer, we would have tremendous tides circling the Earth. If it was that much closer, no life would be possible at all for a long period of time. The moon is just the ideal distance from the Earth, distance and sizes taken into account, so that we have the tidal system, which sweeps the rubbish out into the sea, stirs the ocean, causes the plankton to be aerated, which is the building block of marine life, the food for marine life. Everything is just right. But if the Earth and the moon are very old, then no life possible until very, very recent times. It fits what the Bible says, the Bible timescale. And this is a fairly recent discovery. Dinosaur bones have been around for a long time, but were allegedly extinct 66 million years ago. And everybody knows that blood and soft tissue can't exist for thousands of years, let alone millions of years. And yet, back in 2005, this Mary Schweitzer discovered that in her fossilized bones were tissues which were very soft and elastic and remains of blood. She couldn't believe it. She repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. And after about 20 times of getting the same results, she went to her boss, and he wouldn't believe it until he saw the evidence. And this absolutely shook the scientific world, because it showed that the dating process of the extinction of the dinosaurs of 65 or 66 million years ago just couldn't be true, because you have this evidence of something which could only exist a short period of time. And it's much more reasonable to believe that it is the dating process which is wrong. The Bible framework is correct, that the dinosaurs were creatures which were taken onto the ark, were in existence after the flood, which we read about them in Job chapter 39 and 40, but have died out because of changed conditions. And so these bones which are left contain material which isn't millions of years old, but could be just a few thousand years old. So it is quite a strong evidence for a young Earth. Carbon-14 in buried diamonds. Remember, the half-life of carbon-14 we said was 5,700 years. So after about 10 half-lives, you shouldn't be able to detect any carbon-14 in an object. So diamonds are allegedly 1,000, from 1 to 3.5 billion years old. That's 175,000 half-lives. So there should be absolutely no carbon-14 in buried diamonds. And yet we find measurable amounts of carbon-14 in buried diamonds. So again, it points to the fact that the timescales that evolutionists give are wrong. It's much more recent, and therefore, if formed in the time of the flood, yes, we would expect to find carbon-14 in it. It fits the Bible, not evolutionary timescale. So we see the complexity of life, and there's no mechanism that would permit evolution to get so complex that things, chance random mutations, don't increase information, they lose information. So there's no mechanism. It is a matter of faith that evolution took place and explains how we came to being. If you ask an evolutionist for his best evidence to show the transition from one creature to another, there isn't really any. The evidence isn't there. It is a matter of great faith. And I say, what has really disturbed the today's community is this fact that nothing is simple. And the stunning pictures sent back from the James Webb telescope, which was manoeuvred into position last year and began to send back pictures middle of last year, show that everything is complex. Its resolution is much better than the Hubble telescope, which was launched 31 years earlier. And so it's given extra clarity to what they can see in space. Now, after it was launched, things seemed to go very quiet, and I didn't understand why until doing a bit of internet research. It was because what James Webb was showing with the telescope is life which was supposed to get simpler the further back you go in time, just wasn't. It was whatever they looked at was complex. The galaxies were complex galaxies. They weren't simple galaxies. And it has caused the whole world of evolution and astronomy to have to say, we've got to think again. It has challenged the beliefs and thinking of the Big Bang. Big Bang postulated that what James Webb telescope would find was the further back in time we go, and the simpler the galaxies would be, the less formed into disks they would be. They'll be cruder and fewer stars. And that's just not the case. The telescopes, this is last year, the telescopes' astonishingly sharp pictures have shattered astronomers' preconceptions about the early universe. We had in mind an idea of what galaxies at these distances would look like and how much detail we'll be able to see. But I think the reality is just kind of blowing our mind. And this person says, with Webb just at the beginning of a planned 20 plus years of work, astronomers know that they have a lot of changes ahead. Right now, I find myself lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering if everything I've ever done is wrong, because it hasn't shown the Big Bang theories to be correct. Now, the astronomers are saying, well, we've still got to stick to the Big Bang, but we've got to find different explanations, because it would appear that the universe isn't expanding. And so the whole basis of everything is being thrown into disarray. It potentially changes our whole view of how galaxies of what sizes evolve over time. So says Hubble studies suggested that galaxies start out small and grow larger over time. But the Webb findings hint that Hubble didn't have the whole picture, and so galactic evolution might be more complicated than scientists had anticipated. And then the sort of beginning of the year from Sky and Telescope, it's finding too many early galaxies. They're finding that they're more mature and more numerous than expected. The results may end up changing what we know about how the first galaxies formed. They're young, but they're also mature. Despite their youth, the galaxies had shapes similar to those nearer to us, mature ones. The percentage of disk galaxies declined only slightly in the early universe, while the fraction of those with a central bulge and those with an irregular shape stayed roughly constant over cosmological time. As it said, this is an embarrassment of distant galaxies. And they've identified 6 galaxies from the James Webb, which existed, they say, 500 to 700 million years after the Big Bang, so very early on. But they're as big as the modern Milky Way galaxy, a feat that scientists didn't think was possible. It's bananas. We just don't expect the early universe to be able to organize itself that quickly. These galaxies should not have had the time to form. But researchers soon discovered that the early universe was much more complex and exciting than they could imagine. And finally, this headline, some scientists speak of a crisis in cosmology, have good reason. Just like atoms in the building blocks of chemistry, galaxies are the building blocks of cosmology. The standard model of cosmology gives astronomers a way to link observed distances to objects with their age. However, new images from the James Webb Space Telescope and galaxies far more distant and hence far older than what the standard model of cosmology predicts. The new data provides compelling evidence that the model might need to be updated. And that is what is happening. Are having to update their ideas because it has shown the complexity of the universe. Nothing simple. This fits in with what the Bible says. God created the heavens and the earth, and he completed them and brought about this complex system of galaxies, all mature, all beautifully formed, because that's what he did. And he tells us that is what he did. Now, going back a few more years, 2009, the New Scientist caused a big stir with this front cover to the New Scientist. Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. And there's a lot of objection to this article, but what it was saying, Darwin's idea that we have a common ancestor and we can trace all these branches, the grasses and the reeds and then the trees and then the birds and the animals and finally man at the top of the tree, all linking back to a common ancestor at the beginning. They come to the conclusion that that idea of Darwin is completely wrong and that all we have are the tips of the tree. It's exactly what the Bible says. God created the grasses, the birds, the insects, man, the animals. And there is no concept of a common ancestor. That is all missing, doesn't exist. And so it all points to a wonderful creation, not billions of years ago and evolving over time, but of a very complex world. And I'll say the more we know about it, the more complex it is, which God has made and keeps under his control and has given us his word, the Bible, to be our guide so that we can be part of that work which he has with the earth. So creation is something which we can hold on to. It hasn't need to be changed over the years. It's evolution, which is constantly changing because everything new discovery just puts it into confusion and chaos. So we'll take a break now and then we'll just look at a shorter section on the principles, flaws and assumptions with dating methods. Thank you.